Jordan, a musician, purchased an antique piano from an estate sale. The piano was beautiful, with intricate carvings and an elegant design. When Jordan played it, the sound was hauntingly beautiful, though it carried an eerie undertone that unsettled him. At first, Jordan was fascinated by the piano's unique tone. However, as days passed, he noticed something strange. The piano began to play by itself. Soft melodies would drift through the room in the dead of night, and Jordan would wake to find the keys moving, as if an invisible hand was pressing them. Determined to uncover the mystery, Jordan researched the piano's history. He discovered that it had once belonged to a composer named Victor Lestrange, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Victor was known for his melancholic compositions, and local legends said his spirit remained tied to the piano. One night, Jordan was practicing at the piano when the melody grew more intense and ominous. The keys moved with a force of their own, creating discordant, unsettling notes. The room grew colder, and Jordan felt an oppressive presence surrounding him. The melody seemed to echo the torment and despair Victor had experienced before his disappearance. Jordan consulted a historian who specialized in haunted artifacts. The historian revealed that Victor's final composition was a tragic piece, believed to be a reflection of his descent into madness. The melody had become a conduit for Victor's restless spirit, forever trapped in the piano's music. Despite his fear, Jordan felt compelled to play the melody through. As he did, the room was filled with a cacophony of ghostly voices and phantom music, growing louder and more frantic. Jordan felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the spirit of Victor was trying to communicate something urgent and tragic. When Jordan finished playing, the room fell eerily silent. The piano's keys stopped moving, and the temperature returned to normal. However, the haunting melody had left a lasting impact. Jordan could no longer bear to be near the piano. He decided to sell it, hoping to rid himself of the oppressive presence. The piano was sold to an unsuspecting buyer, who soon began experiencing similar disturbances. The haunting melody persisted, leaving a trail of fear and despair wherever the piano went. Jordan, meanwhile, was left with haunting memories of his encounter, and the melody's echoes lingered in his dreams, a chilling reminder of the spirit trapped within the keys. Anna was a newly hired nurse at a rural hospital, known for its old architecture and occasional electrical issues. One night, she was assigned to the night shift alone in the ward. The hospital had a chilling reputation for strange occurrences, but Anna was skeptical until she encountered something truly terrifying. Around midnight, Anna received a call about a new patient who had been admitted. The name on the chart was unfamiliar, but the room number matched a recently vacated room. When she entered, she found a frail old man lying in the bed, his eyes closed as if in sleep. Despite her best efforts, the man did not respond to her care. An eerie coldness filled the room, and Anna's unease grew. By morning, the man had vanished, leaving only an empty bed and cold sheets. The hospital records showed no record of the patient, and the room had been empty for months. The incident was chalked up to a mistake, but Anna was haunted by the encounter. The phantom patient, she realized, was likely a ghost of someone who had died under mysterious circumstances, forever searching for solace in the hospital's dark corners. When Lucas moved into his new apartment, his friends gifted him a vintage mirror as a housewarming present. The mirror was ornate and beautiful, with an intricate frame. Lucas admired it, though it had an odd, musty smell. He hung it in his bedroom, but soon noticed strange occurrences. At night, Lucas would hear faint whispers and see shadows moving in the mirror's reflection. The shadows seemed to interact with him, as if trying to communicate. Disturbed, Lucas tried to ignore it, but the disturbances escalated. He saw dark figures approaching him in the mirror, and sometimes they appeared to be reaching out. One night, Lucas decided to investigate the mirror's origins. He discovered it had once belonged to a family who had suffered a series of tragic deaths, each one marked by eerie phenomena. The mirror, it turned out, was a conduit for restless spirits seeking vengeance or recognition. Lucas decided to dispose of the mirror, but the haunting images lingered in his mind, leaving him with an enduring sense of dread. Emma and her partner, Jake, bought an old, charming house with an intriguing layout. While renovating the basement, they discovered a hidden door behind a wall. Curious, they pried it open and found a small, dusty room filled with old books, journals, and disturbing artifacts. Among the items was a journal detailing bizarre experiments and occult practices. The previous owner, a reclusive scholar, had conducted experiments on the boundaries between life and death. Strange symbols and notes suggested attempts to contact otherworldly entities. Emma and Jake soon noticed strange occurrences, unexplained noises, cold spots, and unsettling dreams. One night, Jake saw a shadowy figure standing at the door to the secret room. Terrified, they contacted a paranormal investigator, who confirmed the presence of lingering spirits. The investigator's findings suggested that the experiments had left a lingering disturbance. Emma and Jake decided to seal the room permanently, but the feeling of being watched never left their home. Claire was a late-night radio DJ known for her spooky shows and urban legends. One evening, she received a call from a listener who claimed to be in a dire situation. The caller's voice was distorted, and the details of the story were unsettling. A tale of being pursued by something malevolent. As Claire continued her broadcast, the listener's story grew more disturbing, with details aligning eerily with local unsolved disappearances. The caller mentioned knowing intimate details about Claire's own life, including her family. Concerned, Claire contacted the authorities. They traced the call to an abandoned building nearby. When the police arrived, they found no trace of the caller or any evidence of recent activity. The building was empty, and Claire's fears grew as she realized the caller had been a ghostly entity, relaying the final moments of a tragic event. The broadcast had been a chilling message from beyond, blending horror with reality. Sam adopted a stray dog named Max from a local shelter. Max was affectionate, but seemed oddly anxious around the house. Strange things began happening, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing without explanation. One day, Max vanished without a trace. Sam searched everywhere but found no sign of him. A few days later, Max reappeared at the doorstep, looking disheveled and fearful. Sam noticed that Max's behavior had changed drastically. He now cowered at every noise and seemed to be hiding from something. Desperate to understand, Sam checked with the shelter and learned that the dog had a history of being found in abandoned, haunted places. The shelter's staff hinted at Max's previous encounters with malevolent forces. Sam realized that Max had been exposed to something beyond comprehension during his absence. The house's unsettling atmosphere persisted, and Sam could never fully understand what had frightened Max so profoundly. Emily lived in a quaint cottage at the edge of a dense forest. She enjoyed the solitude until she began feeling an invisible presence. Strange noises and cold spots became frequent, and she felt as though someone or something was watching her every move. One night, Emily heard a scratching sound outside her window and saw shadowy figures moving in the darkness. She decided to install motion sensor lights around the property. To her horror, the lights revealed no one, but the unsettling feeling continued. Emily discovered that previous tenants had reported similar experiences. Research revealed that the cottage was built on land with a tragic history of disappearances. The sensation of being watched was linked to restless spirits of those who had vanished, forever haunting the area in search of closure. Rachel found an old diary at a garage sale. The diary's pages were filled with disturbing entries about a woman's descent into madness and her eventual disappearance. Intrigued, Rachel kept the diary, but strange things soon began happening. Unsettling dreams, eerie sounds, and a growing sense of dread. Rachel tried to return the diary, but it was too late. The disturbances escalated. She learned that the diary had once belonged to a woman who had been cursed by a vengeful spirit. The entries revealed details of dark rituals and pleas for help that were never answered. Desperate to rid herself of the curse, Rachel performed a cleansing ritual as described in the diary. Though the disturbances lessened, she could never fully escape the feeling of the malevolent presence that had followed her. The diary's dark history left an indelible mark on her life, reminding her of the dangers that lurk in forgotten pages. Tom moved into a high-rise apartment building known for its strange occurrences. One evening, while alone, he decided to test a local urban legend about a game involving the building's elevator. According to the story, if you press a specific sequence of buttons, the elevator will take you to another dimension. Tom followed the instructions meticulously. Press floor 1, then 5, then 2, and finally 10. The elevator jolted and the lights flickered. When the doors opened, Tom found himself in an eerie, dimly lit version of his own building. Everything was slightly off. The walls were peeling, and the air was thick with a musty smell. As he explored, he noticed shadowy figures moving in the corners of his vision and heard whispers in a language he didn't understand. Panicked, he rushed back to the elevator, but the doors wouldn't open. When they finally did, Tom was back in his building, but with a chilling realization, the figures and whispers had followed him back. His apartment felt different, and every night since, Tom would hear those same whispers growing louder, hinting that he had brought something malevolent from the other dimension. Jenny had just purchased an old house with a history of being on the market for years. While exploring the basement, she discovered a hidden trapdoor beneath a rotting rug. Curious, she pried it open and found a small, hidden basement filled with old furniture and strange symbols drawn on the walls. Among the items, she found a diary detailing disturbing rituals and occult practices. As she read through it, she realized the previous occupant had been involved in dark magic, attempting to summon otherworldly entities. That night, Jenny started experiencing bizarre phenomena. Objects moved on their own, strange noises echoed through the house, and shadowy figures appeared at the edge of her vision. The diary had unleashed a presence she couldn't control. Desperate to rid herself of it, she sought help from paranormal experts, only to find that the rituals had permanently disturbed the house's spiritual balance. The presence remained, a constant reminder of the horrors that lay hidden beneath her home. Emma inherited a beautiful, antique painting from her great aunt, a renowned artist. She hung it in her living room, admiring its dark, enigmatic beauty. Soon after, Emma began noticing that the painting seemed to change subtly. Faces in the background seemed to shift, and shadows moved when she wasn't looking. One night, Emma saw a figure emerge from the painting, a shadowy, distorted face that seemed to reach out. She tried to remove the painting, but it was as if it was fused to the wall. Terrified, she sought out the history of the artist, only to discover that many of his paintings were rumored to be cursed. Each one held a piece of a tormented soul, forever trapped within the artwork. Emma's attempts to rid herself of the painting were futile. It became a permanent fixture in her home, and the figure within it seemed to grow more menacing, feeding off her fear and despair. Mike and his friends decided to camp in a remote forest, known for its strange occurrences. Locals spoke of a forbidden area deep within the woods where people had gone missing. Intrigued, the group set out to explore this area, armed with flashlights and camping gear. As night fell, they ventured into the forbidden section. Strange noises and flickering lights unnerved them, but they pressed on. They came across an ancient, overgrown structure with inscriptions in a language they didn't recognize. The inscriptions warned of a malevolent spirit that preyed on those who ventured too close. The group laughed off the warnings until they started experiencing terrifying phenomena, shadows moving on their own, disembodied voices calling their names, and an overwhelming sense of dread. They hurriedly left the forest, but the encounter left a lasting impact. Each member of the group began to suffer from haunting nightmares and a pervasive feeling of being watched, a consequence of their brush with the forbidden. Emily rented a small apartment in a historic building. The previous tenant had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind a few personal items and a chilling atmosphere. Emily soon discovered that the building had a dark history of unexplained events and disappearances. One evening, Emily received a package addressed to her, but it contained items belonging to the previous tenant: photographs, a diary, and an old, unsettling journal. As she read the diary, she realized the previous tenant had been documenting disturbing experiences and paranoia about being watched. Emily's own experiences mirrored those documented in the diary. She heard unexplained noises and saw shadowy figures at the edge of her vision. The apartment's dark history seemed to repeat itself, trapping Emily in a cycle of fear and paranoia. She eventually learned that the building's disturbing legacy was tied to a series of unresolved cases of missing persons, each tenant becoming part of a sinister pattern. Sarah found an old locket in an antique shop and decided to buy it as a gift for herself. The locket was intricately designed and seemed to have a personal touch. Shortly after wearing it, Sarah began experiencing unsettling dreams and seeing strange apparitions in her home. The locket, she discovered, had once belonged to a woman who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Research revealed that the locket was rumored to be cursed, a vessel for the spirit of the woman who had been wronged and was now seeking revenge. Sarah's dreams grew increasingly vivid, depicting the woman's final moments and her suffering. The presence of the spirit became more pronounced, and Sarah felt an oppressive weight in her home. She tried to rid herself of the locket, but the spirit's grip was relentless, leaving Sarah trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. In a small town, a group of friends decided to explore an abandoned asylum that had been closed for decades. The asylum had a dark history of mistreatment and unexplained deaths. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they ventured inside. The asylum's derelict state was unsettling, but the friends pressed on, documenting their findings. They encountered disturbing sights: old medical equipment, rusted restraints, and unsettling patient records. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive as they explored deeper into the asylum. One of the friends, Tom, began experiencing hallucinations and hearing disembodied voices. The group became separated, and Tom stumbled upon a room filled with old patient files, including his own name. The asylum's dark past seemed to have manifested, trapping Tom in a nightmarish loop. The friends eventually escaped, but Tom was never found, his fate a chilling reminder of the asylum's malevolent legacy. A young woman named Lisa moved into a new apartment that seemed perfect. until she began hearing a persistent whispering in the dead of night. The whispers were unintelligible at first, but grew clearer over time, repeating phrases like, "Come closer," and "You're not alone." Desperate for answers, Lisa consulted a paranormal investigator who revealed that the apartment had a history of unsettling events and previous tenants who had reported similar experiences. The whispers were believed to be the voice of a restless spirit, trapped between worlds and seeking something. As the whispers grew louder and more demanding, Lisa felt a growing sense of dread and paranoia. The apartment's eerie atmosphere escalated, and she eventually discovered that the spirit was seeking closure for a tragic event that had occurred in the building years ago. Lisa's attempts to address the spirit's needs only intensified the haunting, leaving her in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. Lena, a young woman living alone in a rural house, began hearing a disembodied voice calling her name. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the voice became more insistent and distinct over time. It seemed to come from various parts of the house, especially at night. One evening, while investigating the source of the voice, Lena found an old hidden room in the attic. Inside, she discovered a collection of old letters and photographs detailing the life of a woman who had lived in the house many decades ago. The letters revealed that the woman had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Her cries for help never answered. Lena realized that the voice was not a mere prank, but the desperate plea of the woman who had perished in the house. As Lena read the final letter, the voice grew more intense and urgent, filling the house with a chilling atmosphere. Lena's attempts to contact the authorities only led to more unanswered questions. The voice continued to haunt her, a constant reminder of the unresolved mystery that lingered within the walls of her home. Sophie bought an antique doll from a flea market, drawn to its intricately designed clothing and lifelike eyes. She placed it in her living room, but soon began experiencing strange occurrences. The doll seemed to move on its own, and Sophie would often find it in different positions than where she had left it. The disturbances escalated. The doll's eyes seemed to follow Sophie, and she started having nightmares about the doll's previous owner, a young girl who had mysteriously disappeared. Research revealed that the doll was rumored to be cursed, possessing the spirit of the missing girl who had been searching for her family. Sophie's attempts to get rid of the doll only seemed to intensify its malevolent presence. The doll became a source of constant fear and anxiety, with the spirit's anguish growing stronger. Sophie ultimately decided to keep the doll, believing that confronting the spirit might help it find peace. The presence remained, a constant, eerie reminder of the curse that bound the doll to her life. Michael had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood, eager for a fresh start. His neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was an elderly man who welcomed him warmly. They exchanged pleasantries, and Michael soon learned that Mr. Thompson was a retired historian with fascinating stories about the town. One day, Michael noticed that Mr. Thompson's house was strangely quiet. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of the elderly man. Concerned, Michael knocked on the door, but no one answered. After a few days of silence, Michael decided to check in with the local authorities. They conducted a welfare check, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Mr. Thompson's belongings were still in the house, and his car was parked in the driveway. Weeks passed, and the mystery deepened. Neighbors reported that Mr. Thompson had never been seen leaving the house, yet his car had vanished. Michael became increasingly uneasy, especially when he found a hidden compartment in Mr. Thompson's home office, filled with unsettling documents about disappearances in the area. The police eventually declared Mr. Thompson missing, but no clues emerged. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson's disappearance was linked to something darker and more sinister, and the absence of the friendly old man left a haunting void. It's easy to overlook the evil that walks among us. It could be anyone, your neighbor, the person sitting next to you at the cafe, or the quiet couple down the street. In the quaint towns of France, where every face is familiar, people believed in the safety of their routines. They trusted the silence of their communities. But beneath this quiet facade, evil had taken root, hidden in plain sight. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier, names that, to their neighbors, were nothing more than a polite couple living an unremarkable life. They were the perfect cover for the darkest of human depravity. Together, they formed a deadly duo, weaving a nightmare through the fabric of their picturesque town, masking themselves in the shadows as they unleashed unspeakable horrors upon the innocent. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light on the cobblestone streets. Birds sang sweetly in the trees, and the townspeople moved about their daily routines, completely unaware of the darkness that had taken root. Michel, with his calm demeanor and quiet nature, would stroll through the town square, greeting shopkeepers with a polite nod. His eyes, however, told a different story. There was a coldness in them, something unsettling. Monique, his wife, was always nearby. A woman of few words, she blended into the background, her presence almost ghostly. There was nothing remarkable about her, just another face in the crowd. But behind the curtain of normalcy, there was a horrifying secret. Together, they lived a life of shadows, a life where they could move unnoticed through the streets, plotting their next move. Their victims, like the townspeople, never saw them coming. No one knew how it started. Perhaps it was a conversation whispered in the dead of night. Perhaps it was a look shared across the dinner table. But somewhere along the way, Michel's desires became too twisted for him to hide. He had a hunger, a dark urge that he could no longer control. And Monique, broken by her own past, became more than just his wife. She became his accomplice. It all began with a pact. Michel, the predator, had a taste for young girls, an obsession he fed on in secret. Monique, once a victim herself, could have turned away, but instead, she joined him in his depravity. It was as if some dark force had bound them together. Their relationship wasn't built on love. It was built on blood. Michel needed someone who could lure the innocent into his clutches, and Monique played her role perfectly, like a spider weaving her web. Together they became unstoppable. They were partners in the darkest of crimes, feeding off each other's evil, growing bolder with every step. The townspeople continued their lives, blissfully ignorant of the horror lurking in their midst. The true nature of the couple remained buried beneath layers of deceit and darkness. Her name was Elise. She was only 16, with a whole life ahead of her. She was walking home from school one afternoon when she noticed the car. Monique was behind the wheel, smiling sweetly, offering her a ride. Elise hesitated, but Monique's motherly demeanor put her at ease. What harm could come from accepting a ride from someone so harmless? As soon as Elise shut the door behind her, she knew something was wrong. The air in the car felt heavy, oppressive. Michel was in the back seat, silent, his eyes watching her through the rearview mirror. The road twisted and turned, leading deeper into the woods, away from the safety of town. Elise's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced out the window, watching the trees blur by. They were heading into the unknown, and she could feel the walls closing in on her. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer, and soon the car stopped in the middle of nowhere. Her cries echoed through the empty woods, piercing the stillness of the air, but no one heard. No one was coming. Michelle and Monique had chosen their location carefully, far from prying eyes, far from help. Together, they silenced her forever. The woods became her tomb, and their trail of horror had only just begun. After release, there were more. Michel was not a hunter of animals, but of the innocent. His eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger as he stalked his prey, each new victim fueling his insatiable thirst for control and death. But he wasn't alone. Monique, who had once been meek and broken, had become something else entirely, a predator in her own right. They perfected their methods. Monique would lure the victims, using her unassuming nature to disarm them. Michel would strike, quick and brutal. Their targets were always the weak, the vulnerable, the ones who couldn't fight back. Girls with wide, trusting eyes, boys with no one to notice when they disappeared. They used deceit, fear, and brutality to capture their prey, leaving nothing behind but echoes of terror. Each new life they took added to their growing list of victims. The fear they created was tangible, a dark cloud that hung over the town, though no one could pinpoint its source. Years passed, and the couple's evil remained hidden, a cold silence between their public faces and their private monstrosities. To the outside world, they were just Michel and Monique, a quiet couple who kept to themselves. They weren't social, but they weren't suspicious either. Their neighbors would see them out on walks, hand in hand, like any other couple. Michel, with his stoic face, always seemed distant, but never alarming. Monique, with her withdrawn nature, was simply seen as shy. Together they existed on the edge of society, just close enough to blend in, but far enough to avoid suspicion. Their modest home was a place of nightmares. The rooms were filled with the remnants of their crimes, trophies of the lives they had taken. But no one ever crossed the threshold of that house. No one ever heard the screams that had once echoed within those walls. Michel and Monique were masters of deception, keeping their horrors concealed behind locked doors and closed curtains. To the outside world, they were just another faceless couple, nothing more than shadows in the crowd. As the years wore on, Michel's thirst for control deepened. He had to have more. His desire for power over life and death consumed him. But with each kill, his grip on reality loosened. The line between predator and prey blurred, and Michel began to spiral. Monique watched as her husband unraveled. She too had changed. No longer the passive accomplice, she had become an active participant in the slaughter. The darkness that had once frightened her now filled her with a sense of purpose. Together, they were no longer just a couple. They were monsters. But even monsters can't hide forever. It started with a mistake. Michel, in his growing arrogance, became careless. He was no longer satisfied with the small victories, the quiet killings. He craved recognition, though he didn't realize it. His ego blinded him to the cracks forming in their perfect facade. One of their victims escaped. She was broken, battered, but alive. She told the authorities what had happened, describing a faceless couple who had taken her, who had tried to destroy her. Her story was dismissed at first, too fantastical, too horrifying. But the police couldn't ignore the growing number of disappearances. Soon, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Michael's name started to surface in connection with the missing girls, and once the authorities began to dig deeper, they realized they had a monster on their hands. The night Michel was captured, there was no dramatic chase, no final confrontation. He had grown sloppy, and his ego had become his downfall. The police moved swiftly, arresting him as he left his home one morning, his face cold and expressionless, as though he knew this moment was inevitable. Monique watched from the window as they took him away, her face a mask of calm. She knew they would come for her too, and they did. But she didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply let them take her, just as she had taken so many others. The town, once so quiet and unassuming, erupted in shock and horror. The people who had lived next to Michelle and Monique, who had greeted them on the streets, who had smiled and waved at them in passing, now realized they had been living alongside true evil. The truth was too much to bear. When the truth came to light, it shocked the nation. The faceless couple, Michelle and Monique, had claimed the lives of so many, and their acts were as monstrous as they were methodical. Their victims were finally given voices, and the stories that emerged were more horrific than anyone could have imagined. The press dubbed them the Faceless Killers, a title that seemed fitting. To the outside world, they had always been faceless, blending into the background, unnoticed, unremarkable. But now, their true faces had been revealed, and the horrors they had committed could never be forgotten. Even after they were imprisoned, the specter of their crimes loomed large. The families of the victims, the towns they had terrorized, and the people who had once known them could never escape the shadow they had cast. Michelle and Monique would spend the rest of their days behind bars, but the horrors they committed would never be locked away. The memories of their victims, their twisted legacy, would forever haunt the memories of those who knew the truth. Some monsters don't need masks to hide their evil. Sometimes, the most terrifying creatures are the ones who live among us, faceless in the crowd, unseen until it's too late. It was a chilly October night when Brian found himself driving through a remote stretch of highway. His old pickup was running on empty, and he had hoped to make it to the next town, but the gas gauge stubbornly hovered at E. As luck would have it, he spotted a flickering light in the distance, a lone gas station illuminated by a single, weary neon sign. Brian pulled into the station, which looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The station was old, with a faded awning and rusty pumps. The place had an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. The only sign of life was a flickering overhead light, casting strange shadows across the cracked pavement. He approached the pump, which, despite its age, seemed functional. As he was filling up his tank, he noticed the gas station attendant. The man appeared out of nowhere, wearing a tattered uniform and a cap pulled low over his face. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he was struggling against some unseen force. "Evening," Brian said, trying to make small talk. The attendant looked up briefly, his eyes hidden in shadow. "Evening?" Brian shrugged off the unease, creeping up his spine, and continued to fill his tank. As he was finishing up, he glanced at the old attendant again, only to find him standing motionless, staring intently at him. There was something unsettling about the man's expression. It was almost as if he was waiting for something. With the tank full, Brian walked over to pay. The attendant was now behind a small, grimy counter, his eyes fixed on a dusty old ledger. Brian noticed the counter was covered in strange artifacts, old photographs, faded newspaper clippings, and an assortment of peculiar trinkets. "How much do I owe you?" Brian asked, trying to ignore the creepy atmosphere. The attendant slowly looked up. "No charge," he said in a gravelly voice. "But be careful out there." Brian gave a confused nod and headed back to his truck. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The gas station's flickering light grew smaller in his rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. A few miles down the road, Brian saw something strange. A car's headlights illuminated a series of discarded objects scattered across the road: old tires, rusted metal, and torn clothing. He felt a chill as he recognized a familiar item, a faded photograph of a family. The family looked eerily similar to the one in a picture on the gas station counter. Brian's unease deepened. He pushed the accelerator, desperate to get as far away from that creepy place as possible. His phone, which had been working fine earlier, now had no signal. The radio crackled with static, and every shadow seemed to move menacingly in the darkness. The next morning, Brian learned that the gas station had been closed for years. No one had seen an attendant there for as long as anyone could remember. Locals spoke of disappearances and ghostly sightings, with the station's name appearing on missing person reports. Brian never stopped at a remote gas station again. The memories of that night haunted him, a constant reminder that some places are better left unexplored. Late one evening, Jenna, a college student, was driving back home after a long study session. She was exhausted and craving the comfort of her bed. As she drove through a desolate stretch of highway, her car's fuel light blinked ominously. She sighed, hoping she'd find a gas station soon. Just as she was about to lose hope, she spotted an old-fashioned gas station in the distance. The sign read, "Joe's Garage," illuminated by a solitary flickering bulb. The place looked abandoned, but had its lights on, and Jenna decided it was worth the risk. Pulling into the station, Jenna noticed the old-fashioned gas pumps, their paint chipped and peeling. The garage itself seemed to be a relic from the past, with a large, rusty door and dusty windows. Jenna approached the only working pump, which seemed to be from another era. She began filling her tank, grateful to have found this place. As she was finishing, Jenna noticed a shadowy figure moving in the garage. It was a man, dressed in old work clothes, his face obscured by a greasy cap. He seemed to be fixing something on a workbench, his movements slow and deliberate. Jenna tried to catch his eye, but he never looked up. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the sound of the gas pump and the occasional clinking of tools. Jenna tried to ignore the creeping feeling in her gut, focusing on finishing up. When she was done, she walked over to the garage, hoping to pay the man. "Excuse me," Jenna called out, but the man did not respond. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Hello. How much do I owe you?" The man finally looked up, his face still shrouded in shadow. He wore a blank expression and gestured vaguely towards an old cash register on a nearby counter. Jenna approached the register, but it seemed empty. She tried to offer some money anyway. The man shook his head slowly. "No need," he said in a whispery voice. "Just be careful." Jenna, puzzled but relieved, thanked him and headed back to her car. As she drove away, she glanced back at the station. The garage door was now wide open, and she saw the man standing in the entrance, staring intently at her. A few miles down the road, Jenna's car began to sputter and slow down. Confused and worried, she pulled over to the side of the road, only to find the tank was empty. How could that be? She had just filled up at the gas station. Frustrated, she walked back towards the station, but it was no longer there. In its place was an overgrown field with broken fences and abandoned vehicles. Jenna's heart raced as she searched for any sign of the gas station, but it was as if it had never existed. She walked back to her car, feeling a chill in the air. Her phone had no signal, and the darkness around her seemed to close in. The sound of distant, eerie laughter echoed through the night. Jenna finally managed to flag down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest town. When she asked about Joe's Garage, the locals looked at her with a mix of pity and fear. They told her the place had been abandoned for decades, and there were stories about strange occurrences and phantom sightings. Some claimed that the station was a gateway to another realm, and the attendant was a ghost, trapped in time. Jenna never spoke of her experience again, but she often wondered if she had stumbled upon a place that existed outside of reality, a place where time and space twisted in eerie ways. Late one evening, Tim was driving through a desolate area when his car began to run low on fuel. He spotted a small, dimly lit gas station in the distance. The station, called Miller's Fuel, seemed to be open, but looked abandoned and run down. Tim pulled in and began to fill up his tank. The station's pumps were old and creaky, and the lights flickered intermittently. An elderly woman appeared from inside the station, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She silently watched Tim as he filled his tank. When he finished, Tim walked inside to pay. The station's interior was cluttered with old, dusty items, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. The woman was behind the counter, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she handed Tim a receipt with no amount listed, only a cryptic message. "The pump knows." Tim felt a shiver, but paid no mind to the strange note. He left the station, but as he drove away, he noticed that the fuel gauge on his car was fluctuating wildly. It went from full to empty and back again, with no apparent reason. The car began to sputter and lose power, and Tim had to pull over. As he waited for help, he noticed strange figures moving in the distance, their shapes indistinct and shifting in the darkness. When help finally arrived, Tim learned that Miller's Fuel had been closed for years. The locals spoke of the station's haunted past, with tales of mysterious occurrences and ghostly apparitions. Tim never returned to that area, but the memory of the mysterious pump and the fluctuating fuel gauge haunted him. It was a chilling reminder of the supernatural forces that lurked in the darkness.
Small town of Cedar Hollow had one gas station, known as Parker's Pit Stop. It was a relic of a bygone era, its faded paint and old-fashioned pumps. The station had been in operation for decades, managed by an elderly man named Mr. Parker. He was known for his gruff demeanor, but had a reputation for being fair and reliable. One evening in late November, a heavy snowfall had begun, blanketing the town in white. The streets were empty, and the gas station was about to close. Mr. Parker was ready to lock up when a battered old sedan pulled into the lot. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, looked haggard and disheveled. He had a sense of urgency about him, and Mr. Parker noticed he had been driving for hours. "Evening," Mr. Parker called out as the man stepped out of the car. "We're about to close, but I can fill you up if you're quick." The man nodded gratefully. "Thanks. I've been on the road for too long." As Mr. Parker pumped the gas, the man began pacing anxiously, glancing around nervously. He seemed to be constantly looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Everything all right?" Mr. Parker asked, trying to make small talk. The man hesitated before answering. "I'm just trying to get away. There's something following me." Mr. Parker frowned. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around again, lowering his voice. "I don't know how to explain it. I keep seeing shadows in my rearview mirror. I thought I was being paranoid, but I don't know. I just need to get somewhere safe." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden, eerie chill that swept through the gas station. Mr. Parker shivered and looked around. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the snow was falling harder now. He tried to shake off the discomfort and finished up with the gas. As the man was paying, he continued to act restless. "I really appreciate that. I just need to get out of here." Mr. Parker handed him the receipt and watched as the man hurried back to his car. The sedan's engine roared to life, and the man sped off into the storm. The snow continued to fall heavily, and Mr. Parker went inside to close up. As he was locking the door, he heard a loud thud from the direction of the gas pump. Curious, he stepped outside and saw a dark figure standing near the pump. The figure was cloaked in shadow, and Mr. Parker couldn't make out any details. "Hello?" Mr. Parker called out, but the figure didn't move or respond. He felt a sense of dread and quickly retreated inside, locking the door behind him. The night dragged on and Mr. Parker couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his routine tasks. Around midnight, the snowstorm reached its peak and visibility was almost zero. Then, just before closing time, Mr. Parker received a call from the local sheriff. "Mr. Parker, we've got a situation. There's been a report of a vehicle accident on Route 7. We need to check if you've seen anything unusual." Mr. Parker's heart sank. Route 7 was the road the man had taken. He described the vehicle and the driver to the sheriff, who confirmed it matched the description of the accident. The sheriff asked Mr. Parker to keep an eye out for any additional information. As the storm raged outside, Mr. Parker couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He stayed up, watching the snowfall, and waiting for any updates. The next morning, the sheriff arrived at the station, bringing news that no one had survived the accident. The man in the sedan crashed into a tree, and the car had been found abandoned. Mr. Parker was deeply disturbed by the news. The sheriff mentioned that the man had been seen in the area a few days before, and there had been strange reports of someone or something lurking in the shadows. The sheriff's comments made Parker think back to that eerie figure he had seen near the gas pump. Over time, strange things began happening at Parker's pit stop. Customers reported seeing shadowy figures in the parking lot and hearing unexplained noises. Some claimed to have seen the ghostly image of a man pacing around the pumps, mirroring the behavior of the last customer. Mr. Parker eventually retired, and the gas station was sold to new owners. The new owners faced their own share of unsettling occurrences. The stories about the last customer and the ghostly figure became local legend. Some say that the shadows are still out there, waiting for the next traveler to drive through Cedar Hollow. Samantha was an adventurous soul who loved exploring remote locations. One crisp winter evening, she found herself driving through a desolate region, car's headlights cutting through the darkness. Her fuel gauge was dangerously low, and she hoped to find a gas station before running out. After what seemed like hours, she saw a small, dilapidated gas station in the distance. Its sign, "Miller's Stop," was barely visible, and the place looked as if it had been abandoned for years. The pumps were old, with cracked screens and rusted nozzles, but Samantha was relieved to see that the lights were on. As she pulled in, she noticed that the station had a peculiar atmosphere. The air was colder than the surrounding area, and there was an eerie stillness. She parked and began filling up her tank. The only sound was the hiss of the gas pump and the occasional creak of the old building. While she was refueling, Samantha saw a figure moving in the shadows of the station's office. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, with a face hidden behind a thick veil. The woman didn't move or acknowledge Samantha's presence, but Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. Finished with the pump, Samantha walked over to the office to pay. As she approached, the woman behind the counter remained silent and still. Samantha tried to get her attention. "Hello? How much do I owe?" Samantha asked. The woman finally looked up, her eyes dark and hollow. She reached into a drawer and pulled out an old leather-bound ledger. She opened it slowly and traced her finger down a page, but no amount was written. Instead, the ledger was filled with names and dates, many of them crossed out. The woman handed Samantha a faded receipt and said in a whispery voice, "You're lucky to be here." Confused but relieved, Samantha took the receipt and left the station. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the gas station fading into the distance. But as she continued, she felt an unsettling presence, as if she was being followed. The road ahead seemed endless, and her car's headlights flickered intermittently. She pulled over to check her phone, but there was no signal. The only sound was the howling wind and the distant echo of what sounded like a woman's voice. Suddenly, her car's engine sputtered and died. Panicked, Samantha tried to restart it, but it was useless. She stepped out and noticed the gas station was no longer visible, swallowed by the darkness and snowfall. With no other options, she started walking back in the direction she had come from. As she trudged through the snow, she heard footsteps echoing her own. But when she turned around, no one was there. The eerie feeling of being watched grew stronger. After what felt like hours, Samantha saw the dim lights of a house. She approached and knocked on the door, and a kind elderly couple let her in. They offered her warmth and food, and Samantha shared her experience.
The couple's faces grew solemn as they listened. They told her that Miller's Stop had been closed for decades, and many people had reported strange occurrences and ghostly sightings. The place was rumored to be haunted by a woman who had disappeared there years ago, her spirit trapped in the station. Samantha left the couple's home the next morning, shaken by the experience. She never returned to that desolate road, but she often wondered if the echoes of midnight were still out there, waiting for the next traveler to fall into their grasp.
It was a quiet summer night when Mark, a truck driver, pulled into a small rural gas station to refuel. The station, known as Willow's Way, was an old establishment with a worn-out sign and faded paint. Despite its age, the place seemed to be well kept, with neat rows of vintage gas pumps and a quaint little store. Mark was exhausted from his long drive and welcomed the chance to stretch his legs. As he filled up his truck, he noticed the gas station's lone attendant, the young woman with a friendly smile. She was working diligently behind the counter, her presence a stark contrast to the otherwise deserted area. "Evening," Mark said, trying to make conversation. "Evening," the attendant replied cheerfully. "Just finishing up a few things." Mark appreciated her warm demeanor and went inside the store to pay. The interior was filled with old-fashioned knickknacks and snacks, creating a nostalgic atmosphere. The attendant was behind the counter, her movements quick and efficient. "Thanks for stopping by," she said as she rang up the purchase. "Not many folks come through this way." Mark nodded, paying for the gas and grabbing a couple of snacks for the road. He was about to leave when he noticed something odd. The attendant seemed to be fidgeting, glancing nervously towards the back of the store. "Everything okay?" Mark asked. The attendant's smile faltered slightly. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a little weird tonight." Mark shrugged off the odd behavior and headed back to his truck. As he was about to start the engine, he saw the attendant through the window, standing by the back door with an anxious look on her face. She seemed to be staring into the darkness beyond the station. Curious, Mark decided to investigate. He walked back to the store and tried to open the door, but it was locked. He knocked, but the attendant didn't respond. After a few moments, he noticed her slipping out of the back door and disappearing into the night. Mark's curiosity turned to concern. He waited for a while, but the attendant didn't return. He went inside the store, hoping to find her or get some answers. To his surprise, the store was empty, and everything was eerily quiet. Feeling uneasy, Mark decided to leave. As he drove away, he glanced back at the gas station and saw the attendant standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide and filled with a sense of desperation. The next morning, Mark heard disturbing news on the radio. The gas station had been reported as abandoned for years, and there were stories of strange occurrences and mysterious disappearances. Locals spoke of the vanishing attendant, whose image had been captured in old photographs, always with a fearful expression. Mark never forgot that unsettling night. The image of the attendant's desperate face stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the eerie events at Willow's Way. In the middle of a long, deserted highway, there was an old toll booth that had been closed for years. It stood alone, a relic of a time when the road was busy. Travelers often mention the eerie feeling they got when passing by, but it wasn't until Sarah found herself stranded that she experienced it firsthand. Sarah had been driving cross-country when her car broke down on the deserted stretch of highway. The nearest town was miles away, and with no cell signal, she had no choice but to find help. As she walked, she spotted the old toll booth in the distance, its faded sign barely readable. Approaching the booth, Sarah noticed that it was surprisingly well maintained for its age. The windows were clean, and the old cash register inside looked polished. There was a note on the door, written in an elegant script, "Please ring the bell for assistance." Sarah hesitated but rang the bell. After a moment, a middle-aged man in an old-fashioned uniform appeared at the window. His face was obscured by a cap, and his expression was solemn. "Need help?" he asked. Sarah explained her situation, and the man nodded, though he didn't move to assist her immediately. Instead, he simply watched her with a vacant stare. "I'll need to check your car," he said finally, disappearing into the booth. Sarah followed, curious and anxious. Inside, the toll booth was filled with old maps, dusty books, and vintage toll tokens. As she waited, she felt a strange chill in the air. The man reappeared after a few minutes, his expression unchanged. "I'll get someone to help you," he said, his voice echoing strangely. Sarah waited for what seemed like an eternity. Minutes dragged on, and the silence grew oppressive. She decided to leave and head back to her car. As she stepped outside, she noticed that the toll booth had changed. It looked older, more dilapidated, as though it had aged overnight. The man was nowhere to be seen. The bell on the door was silent, and the atmosphere had turned cold and eerie. Sarah decided to return to her car, but when she tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. She waited and waited, but no help arrived. Eventually, passersby stopped and offered to assist her. They were bewildered to find that the toll booth was now a crumbling ruin, barely recognizable as the same structure Sarah had approached. When Sarah finally got back to town and asked about the toll booth, she was met with strange looks. The locals told her it had been abandoned and falling apart for years, and that there were rumors of a ghostly attendant who appeared to lost travelers but never offered real help. Sarah never drove that stretch of highway again. The memory of the lonely toll booth and its spectral attendant haunted her, a chilling reminder of the unsettling encounter. Tom was a truck driver who had been on the road for over 20 years. He'd seen it all, or so he thought, until one fateful night when he stopped at a gas station off the beaten path. The station, known as Harper's Haven, was a small, isolated stop with an air of neglect. Pumps were old, and the station itself had a dusty, forgotten look. Tom was running low on fuel and needed to top off his tank. As he approached, he noticed that the station was eerily quiet, with no signs of life. The only light came from a flickering bulb above the pumps. He shrugged it off, thinking the place was just closed for the night. As he began to fill up, an elderly man emerged from the shadows. He was dressed in a worn-out uniform and had a weathered face. He didn't say a word as he approached, simply nodding at Tom. Tom returned the nod and continued pumping gas. When he finished, Tom walked inside to pay. The man was behind the counter, his eyes shadowed by a cap. He didn't say much, just handed Tom a crumpled receipt. Tom noticed that the receipt had no price written on it, only a series of strange symbols and numbers. "Is this all?" Tom asked. The man didn't respond. He simply gestured towards the door. Tom left the station feeling uneasy. As he drove away, he glanced at the receipt and tried to make sense of the symbols. They seemed to form a pattern, but Tom couldn't decipher. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just an oddity of an old forgotten place. Later that night, Tom's truck started experiencing problems. The engine began sputtering and losing power. Pulled over, hoping it was a minor issue, the problems continued. The truck finally came to a halt on the side of the road, and Tom realized he was stranded. He decided to call for a tow, but his phone had no signal. As he waited, he noticed strange lights in the distance, flickering on and off. The lights seemed to move in a peculiar pattern, similar to the symbols on the receipt. Suddenly, the lights disappeared, and the darkness seemed to close in. Tom felt a chill run through him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The night dragged on, and the truck's engine problems persisted. By dawn, a tow truck arrived, and Tom was finally taken to a mechanic. The mechanic examined the truck and found nothing wrong. It started up without issue, leaving Tom bewildered. When Tom asked about Harper's Haven, the mechanic looked at him strangely. "That place hasn't been in operation for years," the mechanic said. "They say it's haunted. Some folks have seen strange things there, like glowing symbols and eerie figures." Tom never went back to Harper's Haven, but the memory of the mysterious receipt and the strange occurrences stayed with him. He often wondered if the receipt had been a warning of the eerie forces that lurked in that forgotten place. Sarah and Jake were on a road trip across the country, eager to explore new places and make memories. One night, as they drove through a remote area, their car started running low on fuel. They spotted an old gas station in the distance, its sign barely visible through the darkness. The station, named Jackson's Fuel, was surrounded by overgrown weeds and looked abandoned. Despite its condition, the gas pumps appeared to be in working order. With no other options, Sarah and Jake decided to stop and refuel. As they got out of the car, they noticed an unsettling silence. The station was deserted, and the air felt unnaturally cold. They approached the pumps, and as Jake began to fill up the tank, Sarah noticed something strange. The gas pumps had a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound. "You hear that?" Sarah asked, voice tinged with concern. Jake nodded, looking around. "Yeah, it sounds like whispers." The whispers grew louder, and they seemed to be coming from the gas pumps themselves. The words were indistinct, a mix of murmurs and incoherent phrases. Sarah and Jake exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing. As Jake finished refueling, he walked over to the small, rundown store attached to the station. The door creaked as he entered, and the interior was filled with dusty shelves and old, expired products. The store had a musty smell, and the atmosphere was oppressive. Sarah remained outside, trying to ignore the eerie whispers coming from the pumps. She glanced at the station sign. It was partially obscured by the darkness. The name, Jackson's Fuel, seemed to flicker and change as if the letters were moving. Suddenly Jake emerged from the store, his face pale. "There's no one here," he said, "and the store is empty." As they prepared to leave, Sarah heard a faint, ghostly voice coming from the direction of the pumps. It sounded like it was calling her name. She turned around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew more insistent, and the air around them seemed to grow colder. Sarah and Jake hurried back to their car, but as they were about to drive away, they noticed that the gas station had changed. The pumps were now covered in strange symbols, and the sign had transformed into something unrecognizable. Panicked, they drove away as fast as they could. The whispers seemed to follow them, echoing in their minds. The rest of the journey was filled with an unsettling silence, and neither Sarah nor Jake could shake the feeling that they had left something behind at Jackson's Fuel. When they reached the next town, they asked about the gas station. The locals were baffled. They claimed that Jackson's Fuel had been closed for years, and there were stories of strange occurrences and ghostly whispers drove people away. Sarah and Jake never spoke of their experience again. The memory of the whispering pumps haunted them, a chilling reminder of the otherworldly presence they had encountered. Jake and Emma were on a late-night road trip and decided to stop for a quick bite. They spotted a small, 24-hour diner off the highway, with a drive-through window that seemed to glow warmly in the darkness. The diner, Luna's Eats, looked inviting, and they pulled in, hungry and tired. As they approached the drive-thru, the window was illuminated by a soft, flickering light. Jake placed their order, and the voice on the intercom sounded clear and cheerful. They were instructed to wait at the window for their food. The wait was unusually long, and as they sat in the car, they noticed that the diner's sign was flashing erratically. The lights inside flickered, creating a strange, disorienting effect. Emma glanced at the menu board, which seemed to be displaying random, nonsensical items. Finally, a woman appeared at the drive-thru window, carrying a bag of food. She smiled warmly, her face partially hidden by the dim light. Jake thanked her and drove away, eager to eat. As they continued down the road, they opened the bag and found that it was empty. Confused and frustrated, they looked back at the diner, but it was no longer there. The area was now an open field, with nothing but darkness stretching out before them. Jake and Emma tried to make sense of what had happened. They turned around and drove back to where they thought the diner had been, but it was as if it had vanished completely. There were no signs of the diner, and the road seemed unfamiliar. They eventually found a gas station and stopped to ask for direction. The attendant, an older man, looked at them with a mixture of pity and concern. "You saw Luna's Eats, didn't you?" "Yeah." Jake and Emma nodded, and the attendant sighed. "That place was closed down years ago. It's said to be haunted. People have reported seeing it appear out of nowhere, only to vanish without a trace." The story of the ghostly drive-thru became a local legend, and Jake and Emma never spoke of their experience again. The memory of the empty food bag and the disappearing diner haunted them, a chilling reminder of their encounter with the supernatural. It was a hot summer day when Greg, a traveling salesman, found himself on a long, empty stretch of highway. His car's air conditioning had failed, and he was desperate for a break. He spotted a rest stop in the distance, a small building with a faded sign reading, "Greenwood Rest Stop." As he pulled in, Greg noticed that the rest stop looked abandoned. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and the building was in disrepair. Despite its condition, the door was slightly ajar, and Greg decided to investigate, hoping to find some relief from the heat. Inside, the rest stop was dusty and filled with old furniture and forgotten supplies. The air was stale, and the place had a musty smell. Greg noticed a small cafe area with a counter, but there was no one around. He walked to the counter and found a rusty old bell. He rang it, hoping to attract attention. After a few moments, a middle-aged woman emerged from a back room. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes and had a vacant look in her eyes. "Hello?" Greg called out. "Can I get something cold to drink?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded and disappeared into the back room. Greg waited, but the silence was unsettling. The only sound was the creaking of the old building and the occasional flutter of a loose paper. After a while, the woman returned with a cold drink. She handed it to Greg without a word and then turned and walked back into the shadow. Greg tried to thank her, but she didn't acknowledge him. As he drank the beverage, he noticed that the rest stop seemed to be growing darker. The sunlight outside was fading, and the temperature inside was dropping rapidly. He glanced around and saw that the building's condition was deteriorating further, as if time was moving backward. Greg decided to leave, but when he reached the door, he found that it was stuck. Panic set in as he struggled to open it. The rest stop was now eerily silent, and the shadows seemed to be closing in on him. The woman's ghostly face appeared at the counter, her eyes filled with a sorrowful expression. She seemed to be trying to say something, but her voice was a faint whisper. Desperate, Greg finally managed to force the door open and stumbled outside. The rest stop was now a crumbling ruin, barely recognizable from the state it had been in earlier. The area around it was completely deserted, and there was no sign of the woman. Greg drove away quickly, heart pounding. He later learned that the Greenwood rest stop had been closed and abandoned for years, and there were rumors of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions. The memory of the woman and the decaying rest stop haunted Greg, a chilling reminder of his unsettling encounter. Tom's Station was a small gas station located on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was known for its old-fashioned charm and friendly service. But there was one story that locals whispered about, a story of a haunting that had plagued the station for years. One night, a young couple, Lisa and Mark, found themselves driving through the area. Their car was low on fuel, and they decided to stop at Tom's Station. The place looked as quaint as ever, with its vintage pumps and cozy store. As they filled up their tank, they noticed that the station was unusually quiet. The lights were dim, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. Lisa went inside the store to pay while Mark waited outside. Inside, the store was filled with old memorabilia and dusty shelves. Lisa approached the counter and found an elderly man behind it, wearing a classic gas station uniform. He greeted her with a polite but distant smile. "Good evening," Lisa said. "How much do I owe?" The man looked at her with a vacant expression and handed her a handwritten receipt. Lisa glanced at the receipt and saw that it had no amount listed, only a cryptic message. "Beware the shadows." Lisa felt a shiver run down her spine but dismissed it as a quirky note. She paid for the gas and returned to the car. Mark was already inside, and they drove away, eager to continue their journey. As they drove, they noticed that the night had grown unnaturally dark. The shadows around them seemed to move and shift, and the air felt heavy with an unspoken tension. They tried to shake off their unease, but it lingered. Suddenly, their car's headlights flickered, and they saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by a veil. The figure appeared briefly and then vanished into the darkness. Panic set in, and they drove faster, but the shadows seemed to follow them. They finally reached a small motel and decided to stop for the night. As they settled in, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The next morning, Lisa and Mark asked about Tom's Station at the motel's front desk. The clerk's face turned pale as she listened to their story. "Tom's Station has been closed for years," she said. "There were rumors of strange occurrences and sightings. Some say the place is haunted by a woman who disappeared there long ago." Lisa and Mark never returned to Tom's Station, but the memory of the eerie night and the haunting figure stayed with them. The cryptic message on the receipt became a chilling reminder of their unsettling encounter. In a remote area on the outskirts of town, there was a small, family-run gas station known as Ellis's Corner. It had a reputation for being a bit quirky, but it was beloved by locals for its old-world charm. One cold winter night, Rick, a long-haul trucker, pulled into Ellis's Corner to refuel. The station was quiet, and the lights inside were dim. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Ellis, greeted Rick with a warm smile as he began filling up his truck. As Rick waited, he noticed that the station had a peculiar atmosphere. The walls were lined with old photographs and antiques, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound coming from the back room. Curious, Rick asked Mr. Ellis about the humming noise. Mr. Ellis's smile faltered slightly, and he hesitated before answering. "Oh, that's just the old heater," he said, though the noise seemed too rhythmic and mechanical to be from a heater. Rick finished refueling and went inside to pay. The interior was filled with old-fashioned decor, and Mr. Ellis was behind the counter, processing the payment. Rick noticed a strange detail. There were no other customers around, but the place seemed busy, as if people had just left. As Rick was leaving, he saw a woman standing outside the station. She was dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, and she appeared to be waiting for something. Rick waved to her, but she didn't respond. When Rick reached his truck, he noticed the woman walking toward the station. He tried to call out to her, but she disappeared into the building. Rick went back inside to check. The station was empty, and Mr. Ellis was nowhere to be found. Confused, Rick looked around and noticed that the photographs on the walls seemed to be of different people, all with an unsettlingly similar expression, a mix of sadness and resignation. The humming sound grew louder and more insistent. Rick decided to leave and drove away, feeling a growing sense of unease. As he continued down the road, he saw the woman again, standing by the side of the highway. She was now staring directly at him, face pale and expressionless. Quickly drove past and didn't stop until he reached a truck stop several miles away. There he asked about Ellis's Corner and was met with blank stares. The locals told him that Ellis's Corner had been closed for years, and there were stories of a phantom customer who appeared at the station, only to vanish without a trace. Rick never went back to Ellis's Corner, but the memory of the phantom customer and the strange humming noise stayed with him. It was a chilling reminder of the ghostly presence he had encountered on that cold winter night. Jake and Lisa were on a cross-country road trip when their car broke down on a remote highway. With no cell service and the nearest town miles away, they spotted a small, isolated gas station in the distance. The station, known as Bennett's Fuel, looked old and run down, had a single light on. They pulled in, hoping to get some fuel and find help. As they approached, they noticed that the station seemed strangely quiet. Pumps were old, with faded labels and rusty handles. The building itself was in disrepair, boarded-up windows and peeling paint. An elderly man emerged from the shadows as they began refueling. He wore a weathered uniform and had a distant, vacant expression. He didn't say much, just nodded in acknowledgement. Jake and Lisa felt a strange chill, but didn't think much of it. Once the tank was full, Jake walked inside to pay. The interior was filled with old equipment and dusty shelves. The man was behind the counter, but there was no cash register, only a strange antique device that looked like an old-fashioned fuel gauge. Jake paid for the gas, and the man handed him a receipt with no total listed, only a cryptic message. The gauge tells all. Confused, Jake left the store and returned to the car. Lisa was already inside, and they drove away, eager to continue their journey. However, they soon noticed something strange. Their fuel gauge was fluctuating wildly, showing empty one moment and full the next. The car began to sputter and lose power, forcing them to pull over. They were stranded again with no way to contact anyone for help. They tried to make sense of the strange gauge, but it seemed to have a mind of its own, moving between extremes without any logical pattern. As they waited, the night grew darker and colder. They saw strange lights in the distance, moving erratically. The lights seemed to follow them, and they felt an unsettling presence around them. Eventually, a passing motorist stopped to help and towed them to the nearest town. There, they learned that Bennett's Fuel had been closed for years, and there were stories of strange occurrences and ghostly figures associated with the station. Jake and Lisa never returned to that stretch of highway, but the memory of the vanishing fuel gauge and the eerie night stayed with them. It was a chilling reminder of their encounter with the supernatural. The small town of Birchwood had a gas station called Harper's Garage, which had been a staple for decades. It was known for its reliable service and friendly staff. But one fateful night, it became the setting for an unsettling encounter. Emily was a late-night driver who had been on the road for hours. Exhausted and low on fuel, she saw Harper's Garage in the distance. The station was old but well-maintained, and the lights were on, promising a warm welcome. As she pulled in, she noticed that the station seemed unusually quiet. The pumps were functional, and the store appeared to be open. Emily went inside to pay and found the station's owner, an older man named Mr. Harper, behind the counter. "Good evening," Emily said, trying to strike up a conversation. "Pretty quiet here tonight." Mr. Harper smiled faintly and nodded. He handed her a receipt with no amount listed, only the words, "The last call." Emily paid and went back to her car, feeling a strange sense of unease. She started to drive away when she noticed that the gas station's lights began to flicker and dim. The entire area seemed to be shrouded in an eerie, ghostly glow. As she continued down the road, Emily noticed that her car's fuel gauge was rapidly dropping, even though she had just filled up. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the darkness around her grew thicker. Suddenly, Emily's car stalled, and she was stranded on the side of the road. She tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The headlights illuminated a figure in the distance. It was Mr. Harper, standing by the side of the road, his face obscured by shadows. Emily's heart raced as she tried to get out of the car, but the figure vanished before her eyes. Panicked, she tried to flag down passing cars, but none stopped. The darkness seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped significantly. Eventually, a highway patrol officer arrived and helped Emily get her car started. The officer mentioned that Harper's garage had been closed for years, and that there were stories about strange occurrences and ghostly figures. Emily never returned to Harper's garage, but the memory of the eerie night and the cryptic receipt haunted her. It was a chilling reminder of her encounter with the supernatural and the ominous warning she had received.